So I bring you to a story from the Daily Wire, and it says this. The federal government used evangelical leaders to spread COVID propaganda to churches. Now, that's a bold statement, but I want to go ahead and read to you some of this story so that you can see who are kind of some of the people involved. So it says this. In September, Wheaton College Dean Ed Setzer interviewed National Institutes of Health Director Francis Collins on his podcast, Church Leadership, about why Christians who want to obey Christ's command to love their neighbor should get the COVID vaccine and avoid indulging in misinformation. For those of you who don't know who Francis Collins is, maybe you'll remember this fantastic ditty he sang for us, this rendition of Over the Rainbow. Here's a little bit of that.
Somewhere past the pandemic, when we're free, there's a life I remember full of activity.
And I'm going to give it to you one more time just because it's so delightful.
No more need for a nose swab every time we cough.
Francis Collins is the guy that actually also mapped the human genome, one of the first to do it, and is an outspoken Christian. And so he was on Ed Setzer's podcast. Now, for those of you who don't know who Ed Setzer is, and you find yourself scratching your head to wonder how a man who is supposedly a church leadership guru comes away with this incredible fabricated interpretation of Scripture, let me help you try to understand the argument here. So Ed Setzer essentially is doing this, and I'm going to try to steel man this to the best of my ability. Ed Setzer is essentially grabbing a text of Scripture. You love your neighbor, right? And then he's saying this, kind of a syllogistic argument. He's saying, A, your neighbor is anybody in the global community. And then B, to love your neighbor is to be mindful and to care about whatever behaviors may directly or indirectly impact those people who are in the global community. And then therefore, C, that means you must get a vaccine because there's a chance that you could perhaps spread COVID. Now, that's as charitable as I can possibly be for what Ed Setzer's really after here, is to say that the COVID vaccine is loving your neighbor as Jesus said it in its original context. Which, of course, this is not only seems ridiculous, it is absolutely ridiculous. And let me tell you why. First of all, because this story comes on the heels of Jesus being asked, well, who is my neighbor? And then Jesus clearly tells through the parable of the Good Samaritan, which most of you will be aware of, about a guy that's beaten up by some thieves and robbers, and people ignore him, except for one guy who is a good Samaritan. He comes by and he helps this person out, and then he'll take this person to a hotel, pay for it, and take care of this guy who needed help. Whereas other religious people passed by on the other side and refused to help. So this is simply a story about helping those who have been cast out by society or helping those who have been ostracized. So this Good Samaritan story, obviously, too, is not just about the guy that was beaten up. It's about the Good Samaritan himself, who was, in the eyes of the Jews at the time, seen as somebody who was lesser than them because of his ethnic and racial identity, and maybe even his religious identity. So these are people who are ostracized. And so he's saying your neighbor is the person who is the one you would least expect, maybe the person that you would cast out of society. So it's already clear here that Ed Setzer's stretching the verse a little bit more. But then also, too, it's important to understand that, yes, the verse is talking about helping those who are in need. So maybe you even think to yourself, when you talk about those who are ostracized and those who are in need, maybe you think about the homeless community or something like that. But the one thing you don't really think about is people who are capable of contracting COVID. It's absolutely a propagandist take to conclude that if you are unvaccinated, well, then you don't care about your neighbor. So this totally doesn't take into account the data and what's actually happening on the ground. So let me just be really, really careful with you here and just say this, that an ethical Christian looks at Scripture, interprets in its original historical context, also taking into account data on the ground, objective realities, objective fact, and then tries to come up with as ethical and as honest an interpretation of Scripture as possible. And so, if you were to truly do that where it concerns COVID, then you would have to look at the fact that if you are vaccinated, there is a strong likelihood, according to the CDC and the WHO, that you will still get Omicron. And then you would also look at the facts on the ground that natural immunity is better than vaccine immunity. So I'll tell you what, Ed Setzer, I will take your vaccine immunity, I'll see your vaccine immunity, and I'll raise you with my natural immunity and tell you that I'm loving my neighbor more than you are. But of course, the point is that this has nothing to do with truly loving our neighbor or the fact that we just don't care about our neighbor or we're not loving Christians or we're disobeying Scripture if we don't get vaccinated. What this is really about is Ed Setzer needing to probably apologize so that he can get somebody like Francis Collins on his podcast and to just do a little bit of this, the old rubbing of the halo, so that he can just shine it up a little bit and polish it and virtue signal to everybody who sees the halo so that he can virtue signal to all of those who are listening and say, hey, I'm not a COVID denier. I mean, look, we Christians, we'll listen to what's going on in society and we'll toe the line and we'll do what everybody says to be a good person you have to do. So hey, we'll distance ourselves from people like Joe Rogan and we'll distance ourselves from the facts on the ground. We'll distance ourselves even from an interpretation of Scripture that actually makes sense, because what we need to do is we need to virtue signal to everybody who's watching out there to let them know how woke we truly are. Now, Ed Setzer probably wouldn't consider himself woke, and I wouldn't consider him that way either. But I would say the one thing he's trying to do here is earn unearned moral superiority because of his stance on COVID. And so he's getting a short-term reward for it because he's going to get those people who are absolutely in the COVID hysteria camp to applaud him. And those who are on the left side of the progressive aisle very often to applaud him. Meanwhile, not taking into account the real facts on the ground, which are natural immunity, which is the fact that even if you are vaccinated, you're probably getting it. So again, I just go back to this idea. Like, if you're really loving your neighbor because you don't want them to get Omicron, what if you are vaccinated and you still give it to somebody? Does that mean all of a sudden you didn't love them enough and you better go get 5 boosters and a tramp stamp just so that you can show how holy and good you are? Of course, this is not what true love is, but perhaps there's something also too at the end of the day that needs to be stated. So I'll go back to the article and read just one more little section of it, because I think that this is something that needs to be said. In short, when it comes to leveraging high evangelical offices to influence everyday Christians, arguably no one is better positioned than Ed Setzer. You may not know his name, but if you're a church-going Protestant, it's almost guaranteed your pastor does. So here's the real thing that I think is the issue at the end of the day. Ed Setzer is entitled to his opinion. He's entitled to have whoever he wants on his podcast. He's even entitled to bad interpretation if he wants to promote that kind of thing. But here's the real problem. Ed Setzer may not be some great cultural icon that a lot of people know, but your pastor probably does know who he is. And so what Ed Setzer is doing here is probably an indication that this idea, this notion, this temptation, if you will, to shine your halo, to virtue signal, and to try to win cheap points from the culture is more mainstream in Christianity than ever before. Now, this is an alarming trend. At least it is for me. I hope it is for you too. Christianity has always been good at a couple of things. It's been really good about declaring reality and declaring objective truth. It's been good at declaring the necessity of an objective standard. It's been good at rational arguments, even though those who are atheists are not going to think so. But it doesn't change the fact that Christians among all religious communities have been very, very good and prolific at intellectual arguments for the existence of God. You think about people like William Lane Craig and others. Suffice to say, we've been really, really good at stuff throughout history. One of the things we've been really exceptionally good at is resisting cultural notions and cultural trends and resisting the influence of corrupt bureaucrats and corrupt power upon the church. The church has, not always, but has at times stood as a beacon of light in the midst of darkness. And this is true throughout Scripture, at least. You can see prophets and men of God and apostles withstanding those in power to the face and saying, no, we will not be your puppets. We will not be manipulated by you. We will stand for the truth. And so it is really disturbing when it becomes mainstream for evangelical leaders to be manipulated into COVID propaganda.
You can catch brand new episodes of Indie Thinker with Reed Huberman every Monday and weekly bonus episodes to keep you thinking throughout the week. But you have to subscribe and click the bell to be notified when new episodes drop. If you enjoy this content, make sure to like this video and share it with friends.